Okay, we're all back.
It looks like that, yes.
Looks like it. Okay, great. So I hope you all had some interesting discussions. I know the group that I joined had a very interesting discussion, and I was cut off halfway through my last point, even though I was the one who told Dr. Marie to bring us back. Yes, so I think we're going to take a few minutes just to share collectively in terms of some of the challenges or that we experience when it comes to defining who our learner is. And I'm sure some other great points were probably spoken about or raised that aren't necessarily specifically related to a learner profile. So if any of those did come up, please do share that as well, so that we can make note of it to see if we can discuss it later on in the workshop. So who would like to share something about their learner profile from their institution, or something that just stood out to them while embarking on this exercise? Granny.
Okay, thank you so much, Megan, and good morning to everyone. I think for me, what came out very, very clear about learner profile is the experience the learner brings from their own environment. Or less, for example, if you design for a new, the first year student, you must consider several things. This student might be from a rural rural high school. The level of experience or the level of motivation or the level of engagement with technology might be less. Therefore, and then you in the very same group of first year, you're probably going to have students that are from Model C schools, or what do you call our town suburb schools, where students are mixed and there's a different culture of learning in there. So it is quite important to ensure that all these factors are taken care of. If you introduce any tool or any technology, ensure that you really know the type of student you are going to design for, and all the necessary tools or measurements are there to cap some barriers that could be if the student does not have a technological background. Let's hoping that they have use a computer before. You can't just assume. Ensure that you do a bit of research before you can understand your learner better. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Granny. Anybody else want to share? Tessa, anyone from your group? Lizelle, understanding the barriers to learning is important. Wait, let me just get her chat up. Understanding the barriers to learning is important, as you don't understand all the factors that impacts the student's ability to learn or engage with learning. Most of the things you take for granted actually cause more anxiety for the students, and therefore can impact the motivation and success of the student. Lizelle, I think that's a really great point. One of the members in our group also made mention of the fact that, a lot of students have only ever engaged in facilitator directed or facilitator led learning, mostly in a face-to-face environment. And so, taking them into an online environment, it's not just thinking about like how comfortable and confident they are with technology, or their level of experience using specific tools, but also one of the biggest barriers to learning is actually that they've never ever had to engage in self-paced or self-directed learning before. Yes, Lizelle.
Yeah, it was just, thank you, interesting. We had a meeting yesterday in our faculty, in our school. And what came out is that our student performance last year during COVID and remote learning, they were managing and got got familiar and confident and comfortable with the remote teaching and learning and writing the assessments and exams. And this year, when we are moving more to a blended learning, all of a sudden they had to relearn how to engage with the learning material. And I know this is mostly online, but this is our experience, and this is something that we need to consider, I think, when we are planning our teaching, is they are now failing. We're sitting with a 70% failure rate just because the students are now not comfortable or confident and engaging with the type of assessment, because it changed from last year to this year.
That is very, very, very interesting. Is there anyone else who's encountered a similar issue? Yeah. All right. So
I think, sorry, Megan, jumping over you.
Please, go ahead.
I think your use of the word similar is the one thing that stood out in our group as well. Is that we were interested to find the similarities that exist between specifically universities, but also the barriers to learn. So when we start seeing those similarities, we start realizing that collaboration is essential. And this is, we often think we operate in little silos, but the profile seems to be almost exactly similar. Maybe just to add on to some of the other points is that we were interested to see that our undergrad students are more or less the same as well, 18 to 25 years old, but postgraduates are getting younger. And motivation to learn, just to touch on that as well, is that students often only study what they got accepted for. So really motivating students to learn is an issue. And then barriers to learn, we've got a whole list, so let's rather not go into that, but I think the similarities stood out for us, just to touch on what you've just said.
It's very interesting. And so I think, the reason for this is to kind of highlight, as you're going through your ADDIE process, we usually spend a little bit of time understanding, okay, who is our target audience? Okay, they're between the ages of like 18 to 25. They're a university student. This is their level of prior education. This is the level that we're needing to take them up to. So we kind of do a little bit of like a gap analysis, going, okay, this is the knowledge that they have. This is what they need to acquire. But actually, when you really dig down into it, there's so much more nuance around who our learner is. And that is really, in terms of design thinking, because we really are trying to design a solution that meets the needs or solves the problem for a specific consumer, in this case our learner, really taking time to understand who they are is really, really important. And so a little bit later, we will discuss some tools and some like methodologies that we can use to do that. Yes, absolutely. And I think, along with the socioeconomic element, just is pure access. And, it could be something very, very simple as going, are they going to be digesting the content on a laptop, or are they going to be digesting the content on a smartphone? And even just that difference in terms of how you lay out the LMS. Is your learning management system responsive? If you're using content authoring tools like Articulate 360 or Rise, have you created those to be able to be responsive and to actually give the learner the best experience on the device that they are using, is really important. Yes, Lizelle, I think that's a very interesting one. And maybe some of you who are within a university context can speak a little bit more about that, is that there obviously are university rules and constraints that you're working within, where you are, looking at undergraduate programs versus postgraduate programs, and all of the the credits and the compliance that you need to get through. And if your university has a model or an approach to instructional design for online learning, and almost like a templated approach that they use, how much room is there for creativity? And I think what's great about this is that these are tools that you can fit into any like any process. And really what it is it's around like eliciting information from different stakeholders. That really is what it boils down to. And so I suppose one of the biggest constraints that you're working with is time in this essence. And do you have the time to spend talking to your stakeholders, really, really getting to know them, to understand them, so that you can actually design effective solutions? Because the reality is that e-learning is expensive to design and develop. It's expensive and it's time consuming. And so you want to make sure that it really is having the biggest impact for your learner as possible. Okay, what I want to touch on now in my back to front approach is really looking at, you know, when we look at design thinking, what are we essentially saying? So design thinking, as I mentioned, is a model or methodology that you can apply to just about anything. Yes, Granny, I'm glad that you said that, because it was on the tip of my tongue, and then I thought, no, let me not open up that Pandora's box. Is that when we are designing solutions for our learners, we do also need to consider the lecturers and the facilitators. And I think what can often happen is that we can prioritize one over the other, or we can prioritize one to the detriment of another. So one of the biggest examples that comes to mind for me in terms of projects that I've worked on is specifically around assessments. So oftentimes when you're taking an outcomes-based approach to education, and you're, you know, mapping content to specific outcomes or competencies, you're wanting to make sure that you assess those competencies. And so what can often happen is that you can get into the rut where you're either over assessing your learner, in which case it might be great for the learner because they're being able to monitor and see how they're mastering the various competencies within a program. But also then on the instructor side, do they have the capacity to grade all of those assessments, to moderate, to provide feedback, etc. So agreed. And as well, yes, I think the sad reality is that most lecturers are specialists in their field of study, and not necessarily in educators or in education. And I think that's why having a robust like teaching and learning unit within an institution where, you know, we've got you know, instructional designers, curriculum design specialists who understand the online learning space and can partner with lecturers is really important. Katija, yes, so you've said your transition to online learning and designing for online learning has to be deliberate. Yes. Our group actually touched on it a little bit, in the sense that a lot of the times people assume, and when I say people, I just mean people in general, that online learning is purely digitizing content. So it's almost like taking a PDF slideshow and putting a voice over to it and then putting that on a learning management system. Or it's simply giving learners access to a digital textbook or an ebook. And I think what's interesting is, and I'd be interested to know, for those of you who were involved in the quick switch to online when COVID hit, is, you know, that's almost like, that's minimum viable product. That's like going, okay, we've been hit with this COVID pandemic. We have to put things online because there's no longer the option for face-to-face learning. So we've got to like be quick and dirty. Let's see what we can do as quickly as possible and make sure that the learners have access to course material, versus actually designing and developing something specifically for the online learning environment. And that's taking into account very quickly like different online learning teaching strategies, pedagogy, teaching and learning strategies, thinking very carefully around how you're going to design a course. And that's why this design thinking process is really important, because it helps to make sure that we design an effective course for our learners. So essentially, I think mostly LGPD on online learners are yes. Katija, I agree. To just double down on this design thinking process, you'll see that we call these the double diamonds, which is quite a well-known design thinking tool to use. And so essentially what we're wanting to do is, firstly, we're wanting to design the right thing, okay? So design the right solution, and then design things right. Okay, so we want to design the right solution in the right way. So that's essentially what we're aiming to do through this process. And so what the double diamonds represent is essentially like the convergent and divergent thinking process. So you're essentially starting with a problem. So, and this problem, you might have brainstormed it with a group of colleagues, or in the case of COVID, let's say that our problem is, okay, we've got to make a quick shift to fully online. And now we're sitting with a problem where we've done that, and we've been doing that for a year, and that's now become our like bread and butter when it comes to designing or creating content for online learning. So our problem that could be something like that. And then we got to go, okay, so now we're actually going to diverge in our thinking, and we're going to go from looking at it on a small scale to looking at it on a bigger scale. And we're going to go, okay, let's research, let's discover, let's explore what is our actual problem. So oftentimes the problem that we think we have and the actual problem, or the way that we would define our problem, are actually different. And I think in the corporate world, what often happens, specifically in a corporate environment, is that we will get a client that comes to us and says, we need to develop online learning to train our sales consultants. And that's the problem that they come with. And we then actually go on an exploratory process with them where we go, okay, let's dig into this. Let's dive in. Let's hear, like, why do you say that? What is the reason for you saying that? And we really, really try and understand their business environment, their business objectives, their business strategy. And then actually by the end of it, we go, actually, like, that's what I'm wanting to do. Actually, instead of starting with example. And so this process of going from your problem to your actual problem definition is really important, because what you often find is that the problem that you're trying to solve isn't actually your actual problem, or it might be something that is like one element of the problem that you initially thought, or it might be that you initially thought there was a very small problem, but actually your problem is a lot larger. And then what you do is you go through that same process in terms of designing a solution. So from your problem definition, you really go out and you say, okay, you diverge again and you go, okay, what are all of the different options that we have when it comes to designing a solution? And there's so many different tools that you can use, which we'll look at just now. And you'll go through this whole process of really digging down and speaking to people, having workshops, understanding requirements, understanding barriers, understanding constraints, until you actually get to a solution that works. And that's essentially what we're trying to do with the design thinking process. So just to take you through our approach. So at Groundflr, as I mentioned earlier, we base our course design approach on ADDIE, but you'll see that we've actually added in a whole lot of different tools that we use. And so this approach we developed specifically to map to ADDIE, because a lot of our clients are familiar with it and it's what they know. And so this is a good example of taking a base process like Addy or SAM, if you use SAM, and adding in design thinking elements. So we would always start with is what we call an empathy session with stakeholders. So what that is really, it's another term for a focus group. It's a design thinking terminology for focus group. You know, all these Silicon Valley types with their new terminologies. And really what that is that's there's no set agenda. It really is, okay, talk to me about like the problems that you're experiencing with your sales consultants. Why do you feel that you need to take their training from being face-to-face and facilitated to online? And it is a little bit of it's like an open forum. Anyone can feel free to speak and share their thoughts, ideas, what they're frustrated with. And really what the trick from that is to really try and elicit through those discussions and through that forum any useful points of feedback that can then help direct your approach throughout the process. So instead of it being like a formal like survey or facilitated focus group, it really is this like fireside chat. What do you think? How are you feeling? How can I, as a like service provider, how can I empathize with you? How can I like better understand what your needs are, what your frustrations are? And I think in a university setting, that can happen both with your lecturers or your academics. It can happen with your learners. It can happen with your, if you have like an instructional design like team or unit, it can happen with them. And so really the idea is to try and get input from as many different stakeholders as you can. And what's also very valuable is throughout that process, you'll also start to see who has the loudest voice. And that's an interesting one because oftentimes the person with the loudest voice isn't necessarily the key decision maker. And they might actually have an inordinate amount or degree of influence over other people. So being able to identify who those people are can also help you ask certain people more direct questions and ask them for additional feedback in the future if needed. And then what we'll do is we'll do a more formal stakeholder survey. So that's having identified all of the key stakeholders who require or who have valuable input to give. And what's interesting is that there might be stakeholders who you decide to include in this first little section of the project, who then you don't necessarily need to include them throughout the whole process. And I think that's a tricky one to get right, but it's kind of the principle of like too many cooks in the kitchen. The more people whose feedback you invite, the more information you have, which can be positive, but it can also be negative if you end up just getting into a cycle of arguments and disagreements. But inviting people to the empathy sessions and getting them to fill in the stakeholder survey is a great way for stakeholders to feel like they have a voice, they've given input, and so that then helps when it comes to presenting like the end solution to them. You're more likely to get their buy-in because they've been involved in the process than if they hadn't been involved at all from the get-go. Then once we've done the stakeholder survey, we will then start essentially with so that's almost like pre-analysis. I would call the empathy session and the stakeholder survey pre-analysis activity. And that's really to set us up for having a really, really robust analysis workshop or session with stakeholders. And that's where we'll do things like learner profiling. We'll look at what we call the growth curve. So based on your current e-learning model, based on your current approach to online learning, where are you in terms of the growth curve? So if you want to remain competitive over a longer period of time, like where do you need to be on the growth curve in order to ensure that. And then also understanding what the vision is. So we often talk about the minimum viable product versus the Rolls-Royce version of things. And understanding what your vision is and where do you want to be in 6 months' time versus 5 years' time. And I think that's really where a more agile approach of development and iteration and development and iteration is useful, because we don't need to wait until we can afford the Rolls-Royce version of our online learning lab or whatever you want to call it. It really is going, okay, what can we do now, and what will help us solve the problem now, versus what are the bells and whistles and additional features like seat warming and a sunroof, etc., that we want to add on as we go. But what are we comfortable with having now, and then what do we want to work towards over a longer period of time? And that's really good, because when it comes to requirements elicitation and what those requirements are, we're always going to map those back to that vision setting exercise, going, okay, how important are these requirements? Do we need to have them now, or can they form part of a 3-year solution or a 5-year solution? And then what we do is we then look at requirements. And a lot of people, when I talk about like requirements elicitation and things like that, it actually, a lot of people associate that with like business systems analysis and the tech world. And it mostly is, but actually applying it here can be really, really useful. And that's where we look at things like, as a learner, I need to be able to ... As an instructor, I need to be able to ... And that can be divided into both the pedagogy, the actual content, so the mediums that you use to present the content to learners. So is it video based? Is it text based? Are you using exploratory learning principles? How many feedback loops do you have? Are you favoring didactic learning or interactive learning? And so really that requirements, if I can say that there's one element that I would say is the most important thing, is that requirements analysis session. And what you'll likely end up with is literally like a list of about 100 requirements. And there'll need to be a process of like working through those and prioritizing them. And we'll talk about a tool just now for how to prioritize those requirements. But for me, and that's the part that I get most excited about as well, is because you really start getting into the nitty-gritty of what your solution needs to be able to do, what it needs to look like, what problem is it going to solve, and how is it going to solve those. And then we look at the key learning objectives. So oftentimes, if you're coming from an institution, then a lot of times those will be predefined for you. So you already know like what your outcomes and objectives are. And then what we also do is we do learner journey mapping. So where we really look and go, okay, from the time that a learner enrolls with the institution till the time that they submit their last assessment or do their last learning activity on the learning management system, what does that journey look like for them? And that's really important to do, because it kind of gives us a vision for what the solution needs to look like at the end. And then the outcome of that is essentially an analysis report that kind of takes all of that and documents it and details it and fleshes it out, and then actually comes up with or recommends like a specific solution for the problem. And that solution, like I said, it could be a full online course, it could be one online lesson, it could be, for example, trying to solve the problem, we don't know which learning management system to use. How do we as an institution choose a learning management system? It could be as well, not simple, but it could just be one element like that. And from there, only once we've done all of these things would we then move into content design, so designing the curriculum or the blueprint for the course, the program or the qualification. Then prototyping. So prototyping is also something that is very familiar or congruent with design thinking. And that's around, before we start to develop this entire learning program, let's develop a small piece of it. So let's just develop one module. Let's develop 2 weeks worth of content. Let's present it to the learners or a group of learners that we've selected based on our different learner profiles, and so that we can representation of learners who are likely to experience a lot of the barriers to learning that we've identified, get their feedback, then apply that back into your solution, and do that at key steps in the process so that you make sure that you're getting that feedback and being able to apply it in real time. So as you can see, this is still kind of mapped to analysis, design, development, but we've incorporated elements of design thinking where, yeah, you can still work within your ADDIE framework, but you can slip in these little tools that will really be beneficial down the line. Yes, Granny and Nazalia. So it can become a complaining session. And I think what's very interesting is that depending on what role you play within a university, you are essentially a consultant to your client, if that makes sense. So your client might be a lecturer, your client be the university. And so in the consulting world, we would often say that, people often just want an opportunity to share and get things off their chest, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but always to encourage them to frame it in terms of, well, how can we solve this? And I think that's where the facilitation of it becomes really important. So how you facilitate those sessions. And I think it's up to the facilitator to be very mindful of reading the emotion in the room, so to speak. And that is harder to do in an online environment. Obviously, that's easier to do in person, but also just to read the emotion in the room, and just to not be afraid to actually stop the conversation and kind of say, okay, thank you for sharing. This has been really valuable. I've noted some of the concerns or frustrations that we have. I'm going to read them back to you, and how can we reframe them in as a problem statement versus just a problem, and that's oftentimes quite helpful. Okay, so what I want to do now,
Megan,
yes,
do you want to do? No, I was just going to say, do you want to do the activity on what's your process before we get into the tools?
That's a good idea. Thank you. That is exactly what I want to do. If I can find my slide.
I think it's back.
It's lost. It's fine. Okay. What I'd like to do is, I'm going to keep this slide up. No, let me actually do the tools first, Tess.
Okay.
So what we have is, there are a number of different design thinking tools that I just want to talk you through. Oh, so Granny just actually made a very good point here. Prototyping is key. And I noticed at universities, we just roll out modules without testing. Yeah, okay. So this is something that I was very passionate about when I was working in higher education, doing online instructional design. And one of the, if we go to the ADDIE process, you'll actually see that there is no user testing phase within ADDIE. So it's analysis, design, develop, implement, evaluate. The evaluation phase happens post implementation of the solution. And the idea is that you will essentially, if you were thinking in university terms, you'd potentially like launch a semester or a course or a module. Post that module, you would then collate student feedback, and you would possibly make some changes, potentially to the content, etc., before you then offered that module again for a second time. And so a lot of organizations, e-learning agencies, university institutions don't make space within the development process for prototyping and user testing ahead of go live or launching. And so essentially what happens is that your P1, your first presentation of a course, a module, a program, essentially functions as your user test. And so what happens is that oftentimes it's either a very stressful process because you're getting a lot of student feedback, either in the form of complaints, both in terms of usability. So, oh, I can't upload this assignment. I can't access this piece of content online. Why isn't my video playing? I can't see where do I access my grades? And so there are a lot of things that you can mitigate by prototyping and user testing, both in terms of the content, but also in the technology that you use, and then be able to develop, for example, user manuals and user guides that can potentially help mitigate those kinds of questions and queries and points of feedback coming throughout the first presentation of a course. If you think of cognitive load for a learner, in the online environment, we often just think of cognitive load when it comes to the actual content. So, we don't want to overload a learner with both audio, text-based, and visual media, and then they've got all these things coming at them at the same time. It's like we know we don't want to do that. But what we often don't account for as instructional designers or as anyone designing content for an online environment is what is the cognitive load or cognitive expenditure of just using the technology for the learner. So the LMS that you're using, how user-friendly is it? Does it have good user interface design? Is it based on good user experience principles and practices? And that's something that's quite often overlooked, but can have quite a big impact on the learner's actual overall learning experience. And that's why prototyping as well is important, because it can help us decrease that element of the cognitive load for a learner. So they're not spending time trying to figure out, where do I find this? Where do I find that? How do I, where do I click to see the closed captions for my video? Very simple things that you can help make more explicit, so that you take that away from the learner when they're actually wanting or needing to learn. So what I'd like to do now is just go through some of these tools in design thinking. So I'm just going to do it not quite quickly, but we've got about half an hour left. That's fine. Okay. So the one that we've got a whole list here, and these would all happen mostly during the analysis phase, but sometimes also during the design or development phases. So we've got the 5 W's and H. So that's your who, why, when, why, who, why, when, what, and how. I'm a journalism student, I should know this. So as part of your analysis phase, you're really asking this question about all of your stakeholders. So who are they? When are they going to be taking the course? Why are they taking it? What are they going to be engaging and interacting? And how are they going to do that? So it's your typical, like, how do I get to know this person? My 5 W's and H. Then we're going to look at, okay, what does success look like now versus in 5 years' time? And that's what I mentioned earlier about our, something that we do in our approach is we do like a now vision versus a 5-year vision. And that's also really important just to understand, you can't, you're not going to be able to solve every problem that you encounter with necessarily one solution. And so when you're looking at defining your problem and defining your problem statement, you've got to think, okay, you might have a number of different problems that you're needing to solve for. And so you've kind of got to go, okay, which can we group together and what potentially do we need to park and look at in a year's time or 2 years' time. So it's kind of like we always start with our firefighting, right? And it's your whole like urgent versus important framework, which is challenging. I hate it. But, you know, what are the urgent problems that we need to solve versus, you know, what are the more like systemic or important things that we're going to have to solve over a longer period of time? And that also speaks to your MVP versus your Rolls Royce. So what is your minimum viable product and what is the Rolls Royce? And knowing what that is, what each of those looks like, and what your roadmap is to getting from your MVP to your Rolls Royce. And I think that's really important because oftentimes you can go, you know, you can spend time thinking about like, this is what we want to do, and this is what we want our you know, e-learning or online learning to look like in 5 years' time, and this is the system that we want to be using, and you know, we want to have 100% of students online. And what often happens is that in the day-to-day of life and academics and work, that actually just gets lost and it never happens. And so what's really important is to actually put together a roadmap of going, this is our MVP. In 1 year's time, we're going to have reached this milestone. In 3 years' time, we're going to have reached this milestone. And in 5 years' time, we're going to have reached this milestone. And so, you know, making sure that you actually, you come back to that and you circle back like every year or every 6 months and you relook at that vision and you go, is this still our vision? Is this still what we're wanting to achieve through implementing online learning within our institution? What do we need to do to be able to reach that goal at the end of next year or at the end of 2025? Then we look at how do we frame problems. Oh, back Katija. It's such a small world. Katija is my mother's supervisor for her PhD, which is just so weird. Anyway, another question to ask, which is around, we call them how might we's. So during your empathy session, you'll often have problems that come up. So, you know, someone will say, oh, you know, we just can't increase or decrease our attrition rate for our courses. Or I think who was saying earlier around, you know, we now have a 70% failure rate because our learners aren't familiar with this method of assessing. And so instead of framing it like that, we frame it as a how might we or how could we. So it's like, okay, well, how could we improve our course attrition rate, or how could we decrease our failure rate or increase our pass rate? And so what that does is it's just a helpful mindset shift of going, instead of getting stuck on a problem, let's start thinking in a solutions mindset. So, and really what you're wanting to do with these kinds of like questions is to really encourage like people that there is no right or wrong answer. Like, remember, what we're trying to do here is we're trying to I'm making the little triangles with my hands. We're trying to encourage divergent thinking. So we're really wanting like every option, every possibility, let's just put it all on the table. Like, let's really like brainstorm. Don't be don't think that your contribution is silly or that it's not valid, because it is. And that's a really good way to just start getting people to think in a solutions mindset. Then user profiles or learner profiles we've touched on already, and I think it's probably one of the elements that we struggle with the most in instructional design. And actually, you know, we could have a whole workshop just on, you know, learner profiles and how do you take into account multiple learner profiles and multiple constraints in the way that you design and present online courses. And so yeah, that's really, really important. And I would encourage any of you, if you're stuck with any specific like templates or tools that you're wanting help with, in terms of, what questions do I ask to get to know my learners better? What do I need to pay attention to? You're welcome to reach out to Tessa or myself, and we can help guide you in the right direction there. And then you've got your double diamonds. So that's your convergent versus divergent thinking. And that's really where you're wanting to encourage like your brainstorming methodologies to really just get as much information and detail from stakeholders as possible. And you can do that when it comes to the how might we's, the 5 W's and H, requirements elicitation, etc. But it's just a really nice tool to help encourage people, when do you think micro versus when do you think macro? Because a lot of people, they'll either get stuck on one or the other, depending on their personalities and their preferences and how you phrase a question. So it's quite helpful to say, okay, everyone, we're thinking big now, or okay, we're thinking small. Then there's the learner journey mapping, which is also really important because it actually, in addition to the empathy sessions, it actually helps you think like the learner. So, oftentimes as an instructional designer, we might be thinking, okay, we're designing online learning for the LMS system that learners are going to access the content through. But what we don't understand is that they've had this whole journey with your institution before enrolling into the course, and they're going to have a whole journey at the end. And what we need to do is we need to make sure that both the before and afters also meet the requirements and needs of the learner. So what we don't want is we don't want the learner coming into their like learning scenario or situation already frustrated and overwhelmed with everything they've had to do to get to that point. So even though you might not have like authority or power to change the like application or process, or the graduation process as an example, or certification process, where can you influence certain elements, or can you at least understand that when the learner is enrolling into your course, what kind of technological do they have coming into the program, and how can you help them effectively manage that as they work through the learning journey. Then something else that we want to spend time looking at is like what could go wrong. So not to be Debbie Downers or anything like that, but we always want to be able to identify what are the potential risks involved. Are we willing to carry or shoulder those risks? And how can we potentially mitigate them? Is it something that we want to mitigate and manage now during the design and development process, or is it something that we're okay with waiting until implementation and to go, okay, if that becomes an issue, we'll deal with it then? So that's almost like creating a little bit of a risk register, going, what risks are you foreseeing and which ones are you happy to shoulder, and which ones do you want to make sure that you close and mitigate those risks throughout this process. Then there's the Moscow analysis. So Moscow analysis is a really, really interesting tool that I personally love, but because I love the requirements elicitation phase of analysis. And that is where you go through the prioritization of requirements. So in order to make sure that you develop a solution that solves the right problem and that solves it right, you want to make sure that you are prioritizing the right requirements. And those are requirements that you would have elicited from a variety of stakeholders, lecturers / academics, your instructional design team, your students, potentially your faculty coordinators, potentially even your registrar. And what you'll then do is you'll go through a prioritization process where you go, okay, what are our must-have requirements? What are those requirements that we absolutely need to incorporate into our solution. And those might be compliance driven. So what requirements are linked back to university regulations and requirements that we need to make sure that we comply with. So for example, if it's a case of, okay, well, our online solution needs to have online proctoring tool or functionality, because we need to be able, our learners need to be able to sit examinations remotely in an online assessment environment, and we need to be able to proctor those sessions. Could be something as simple as that. So what are those must requirements? Then, so those are your first level requirements. Then you get your should have requirements. So those are like your second level. So your should haves are like, well, our solution really should be able to do X, Y, and Z, or to meet the needs of X, Y, and Z, and these are the needs. And so in an ideal world, our solution will encompass your must-haves and your should-haves. But there might be something that comes up where it could be a trade-off. So it could be a case of, wow, in order to meet this requirement, we're going to need to spend like, I don't know what a large amount of money is in the university sphere, 750,000 Rand extra per year to be able to meet this requirement. Are we willing? Is that requirement worth this amount of money? Yes or no? And so it might be a trade-off where you've got to weigh a requirement against a constraint, and the requirement actually falls away because the constraint is bigger than the requirement itself. And you might then say, okay, we're going to park that requirement and put that into our three-year plan or our 5-year plan. So let's not ignore it and let's not forget it, but let's just park it and revisit it at a later stage. Then your could haves are your like nice to have. So those are kinds of like your bells and whistles. So those could have requirements usually form part of your like Rolls Royce solution, where you're going, okay, like I'd really like to have like fold away side mirrors, or a sunroof, or you know, I'd love to be able to pair my phone with my I don't know, radio player. I don't know, you can anyway. So those are your could haves, where you're going, yeah, these are your nice to haves. It would be really great if we could have this, but if we have to prioritize different requirements, or we only have like this amount of resources, we're first going to make sure that we can cover the must-haves and the should-haves. And only if we have some leftover budget or resources, or whatever the case may be, then we'll start incorporating the could-haves. And then the W is for the won't-haves. So that is really like, it doesn't matter whether we have all the money in the world and all of the resources in the world. This is just a requirement that we're not going to ever necessarily like care about for whatever reason. It might be augmented reality as an example, where one of your requirements from like a lecturer might be, oh, they really we really want to use augmented reality as a content development tool. And you might go, okay, that's amazing, but actually it's really expensive. We're never really going to have the resources to do this at scale. So we as an institution, whatever the case may be, are deciding that we're not going to develop augmented reality as a content medium ever. That's just an example. It might be artificial intelligence support for learners, or bot support. And it might go, okay, we could spend a lot of time and money doing robotic AI or bot support for our students, but actually as an institution, we are taking like a people-mediated approach to learning. So we'd rather invest in like teaching assistants who can be online at different times of the day to be able to support the students. So in that case, that becomes like a won't have requirement, where you're actually deciding that's not part of your e-learning strategy. Then you have your scenario planning, and that's quite an interesting one, because you might have a number of different possible solutions for your problem. And you might decide to do what we would call A/B testing. where you would potentially develop a prototype for solution 1 and a prototype for solution 2, use a test, collect the feedback, and once you've gotten the feedback on those two, then say, okay, based on the user feedback, we're going to go with option 1 or option 2. Obviously, that is a luxury that a lot of us don't have. It takes time and it costs money, and so, but it is a tool that can be used when you've got more than one possible paths to a solution, and you're like, I'm not actually sure which one will be the best one. There are obviously things you can do, like cost benefit analysis from a more like operational financial point of view. But by doing the scenario planning and the user testing for scenarios, it can actually be quite valuable in terms of understanding which solution will be best for your learner. Okay, are there questions about any of these before we move on to the last bit of the workshop?
I have a question, Megan. Which tool would you say in your experience have you found to be really useful, like that you've used, that's been the most useful to you?
So for me personally, I find that doing the visioning exercise, where we look at, okay, what does success look like in 5 years, is a really important one, because a lot of times different stakeholders have a different idea of what that is and what that looks like. And one of the biggest challenges that we often see throughout this process is just consensus. Everyone has a different idea around, what is online learning best practice. People have different preferences when it comes to content delivery and how they prefer content to be delivered. And oftentimes it's based on their own learning preferences, which is based on their own history and context, how they were taught and how they were exposed to different learning materials education process. So that is really, really important, because it gives us those pillars to work towards. So firstly, are we agreed with what is our minimum viable product, and what is our VW Polo? And so it's a good car, it's a sturdy car, it's a trustworthy car. We're proud of that car. We're proud of our VW Polo. And so we're working towards that, and then we're going, but what does the Rolls-Royce / Bentley look like? And that exercise is so important to have, because of consensus and being able to reach consensus with multiple stakeholders. And I think that for those of us who find ourselves in the role of instructional designer, oftentimes what you're having to do is you're having to wrangle and try and get people to agree and try and reach consensus with a lot of things. And that's probably also a whole nother workshop topic and challenge to work with, but that's definitely what I find to be one of the most important ones. Requirements and Moscow is really important to make sure that we are prioritizing the right things, and that, again, we have consensus. So when you're going through a requirements prioritization process, you need to make sure that you have the right people making those decisions, and you, as the facilitator / instructional designer, you can help them and you can ask the right questions and help guide their thinking, but ultimately they're the ones who are making that call, and you need to make sure that that they're equipped, that they are confident, and that they're making the right decisions. So as instructional designer, we know kind of what they should be prioritizing and what they shouldn't be prioritizing, but it's up to you to get them to realize that on their own and to elicit that out of them. So those are the two things. But then the biggest one, like over and above all of that, really is your user testing. And I think it's the one thing that we just don't get right. in general. And it's arguably the most important thing, because like I said before, you know, I think we've come a long way in terms of trusting online learning and verifying that it does work, that it can work. But, you know, I think up until pre-COVID, there was a lot of like hesitation around online learning, especially in like the traditional university setting, going like, can online learning replace face-to-face facilitation? And will learners be sufficiently supported? Will they be able to like self-direct their learning, etc., etc.? And I think what happens is that when we don't take all of these things into account, when we don't really take the time to understand our learners, to prototype, to use a test, we're going to end up creating solutions that we've spent a lot of money and time on developing that fall flat. And then we're going to blame it on the e-learning. We're going to blame it on the actual like, yeah, e-learning itself, rather than actually saying, wow, maybe the solution that we developed wasn't the right solution. So that is really where the user testing comes in. And for that reason. And the other reason is that oftentimes as instructional designers, we want to create the best, flashiest, sexiest content we can possibly create. And we want to be like cutting edge. You want to see, oh, this is what like this university is doing over there. Or, you know, we often benchmark against like international universities, and oh, this is what like MIT is doing, or this is what Oxford is doing, and this is what Cambridge is doing. And you try to keep up with the Joneses in that respect. And actually, really, is that what's best for your learner? And realizing that what's best for your learner is learning gains, and that they've actually like had an increase in learning gain, that they've developed skills and competencies, that they feel equipped to enter a workplace environment, or if they're doing like a master's, a PhD, like that they feel equipped to enter like a postgrad or academic environment, and you know, they feel confident and equipped, and that confidence factor is really important. And so, you know, you can develop a really, really great piece of learning content that's really well designed. You know, you've got an animation studio to do the animations, graphic designers, videographers, etc., voiceover artists, and it's a really, really well produced piece of content, but it might not actually be what the learner needs, in which case it's going to fall flat and they're not actually going to learn or master the skills and competencies that you need them to master. And sometimes simple is actually better. So yeah. Any other questions before we move on? We have one more activity to do before we wrap up the session. Oh, thank you, Lizelle. So what I'd like to do now is for everybody just to spend some time. We're going to go into breakout groups again. There are 14 of us, so maybe we can do 3 groups. Marie, 4A12. Yeah, let's do 3 groups. What I want you to discuss with each other is to spend some time going, okay, this is the development process that we use at our institution. And based on this slide over here, which I'm going to leave up for you, is to really think about what of these design thinking tools can I start incorporating into my process in order to, thank you, Harriet. What can I incorporate of these design thinking tools into our ADDIE process that we use in order to create a more meaningful learner-centric solution? So I'm going to leave this up here. If you want to take a screenshot, you can. So Tessa has just pinged the question there. Thanks, Tessa, in the chat. And so we're going to go into our breakout rooms, and then you can discuss this with the people in your breakout rooms, and we'll take 10 minutes, and then we will come back to the main group to share any last insights, thoughts, or questions.
Okay, I'll put you into the groups now.
Perfect, thank you.